how many of you are, as you know, the conference is all set up as kind of a track-based, and it's we got the information worker track and the IT pro track where, you know, those guys clap and cheer when they click buttons and stuff. We clap and cheer when we actually build, when stuff works. Building it, I guess it has to work too. I guess it doesn't have to work. Anyway, so how many of you are planning on just staying in this room like for the rest of the day? Great. Now, how many of you are planning on staying in this room for the rest of the week? Fantastic. And the other, how many of you did not raise your hand? Okay, now you feel included, right? Just out of curiosity, because some of this stuff that we have, and I know that later on in the week that Ben and I are going to talk about some stuff, and it doesn't really, sometimes stuff doesn't neatly box up into like 1 hour kind of blocks here, as you saw this morning. So if everybody's going to be in here all week and all day, then we're in pretty good shape to just kind of progress along with all of this. So first, my name is Andrew Connell, so I didn't get to do my intro this morning. I know there was an attempt to do it over the phone, but that would have been a really bad experience, I think. So I showed up on time for this one, thankfully. Somehow I made it through the entire day yesterday with my watch 1 hour off. And then the other person that's going to join me in a little bit is Eric. Eric's going to come up and he's going to talk about some stuff at the end of the session. All right, so what are we going to talk about here? Talk a little bit about the requirements review. So what kind of things came up in the requirements gathering, and what was the things that were defined that we wanted to build? What are the different deployment options that are out there? What are the different development options that are out there? So with deployment, there's really two options available to us. There's an on-prem deployment, which we'll define what that is for those of you who aren't as familiar with that. And then we're also going to have a hosted deployment. The other option that we have, the other thing that we want to talk about is how is SharePoint Online going to be different from what we're used to doing with, say, an on-premise deployment here. We'll look at some of the limitations for developing custom solutions as far as both hosted and on-prem go. Look at our approach to this, some requirements mapping, and then some solution components and sandbox considerations. Okay, so that's what we're going to cover in this module. That might be the biggest agenda list for a session I've seen. So now, let's look at the scenario here. What do we want to build? Well, we said earlier what we wanted to build was a knowledge-based system here. So the idea is to have knowledge that we're going to put in these documents or items in SharePoint. We'll see how we go about doing that as the day goes on. And we want to make it easy to be able to share the content across other people that use the application, but not only find content that is applicable to what we're looking for, but also find people that are applicable to the content that we're looking for as well. Because just finding the content may not be enough. We want to be able to find people as well. Okay? So we wanted to find a very structured way allowing users to search for the content, be able to navigate, browse for the content, find all that stuff, and be able to promote interaction between users. So there's our nice little elevator pitch mission statement that we were looking to go for. So we defined a couple of use cases of things that we wanted to make sure and cover. We wanted to be able to do the classic CRUD applications for an article. We wanted to be able to create, update, and publish an article so that an article could live like in a draft mode before the general public was able to see it, or the general users were able to see it. Make sure that everything looks all fine and good. We wanted to also be able to not only show the detail of the article, but also have like a way of rolling it up and show just a summary bit of the article and not seeing every single little bit here, okay? When we were looking at an article, we also wanted to have a way of seeing other articles that were related to the one that we're working with. Okay, we wanted to see articles that were related to the one that we're working with, not just the specific one we're working with. And so you'll see some stuff that we did around that. I believe that'll come in a little bit later, right? We also wanted to be able to show links from other resources, but things that were outside of the application that we're building. So other additional resources that we could leverage. Finding experts. So that's the people search I was talking about a second ago. I want to be able to find people that are relevant to the content or the terms that I'm looking for. We want to be able to download a PDF of the article, so I don't always have to be online for this. Maybe I'm the kind that still likes to buy a newspaper instead of looking at it on my reader, my e-reader or something. Want to be able to give feedback. Some people that write articles actually care to get feedback. Some of them just put the feedback stuff up there because they want you to think that they care about their feedback, and they just said, submit feedback, but that kind of is going to like brickwall at something.com, right? configure certain aspects, and also be able to configure certain aspects of the application. That's a lot of the stuff that we want to be able to go through and manage. A couple of use cases that we came up with for our application here. Now, after you define the different use cases that you want to come up with, the next thing that you really need to consider here is where is this going to be deployed? And you've got two options with SharePoint 2010, okay? One option is using an on-premise deployment. This is the more traditional or more kind of what we're used to doing for the most part. And this is where SharePoint's going to live on-premise. I'm installing it inside of my firewall. No one else is going to be able to get to it from the outside unless we do some poking of the firewall or just rip the firewall out too. They can figure out the poking of the firewall. We're just going to rip it out and make it work, I think. We're the devs. We are going to maintain all of the hardware. So it's our responsibility to do a lot of stuff. Things like, I've got to have the hardware to go through and install this. I've got to purchase all the licenses. I'm going to have to manage all the stuff for the users and make sure that anything that my application requires is installed on their desktops. Like if I was, by chance using InfoPath or something like that, I would have to have InfoPath installed if I wasn't using the enterprise version of SharePoint to where we get the browser rendered pages there. A bunch of other things too, the configuration, performance. I have to handle the disaster recovery scenario here, right? Which, don't you always find that it's always not disaster recovery? There's always just the disaster part of the plan, right? The recovery part is always the part that we forget about, right? So again, another thing that we're going to punt to those people next door. Now, the other option, which was introduced with SharePoint 2010, is the hosted option. I guess Microsoft kind of introduced it in SharePoint 2007 with the BPAWS offering, but they have this new one, or a more robust offering called Office 365 / but what we're interested in is just the SharePoint Online chunk is the only thing we're really interested in. So what is a hosted deployment? A hosted deployment is essentially saying that someone else is going to manage my SharePoint environment. I'm not going to be responsible for doing the configuration wizard. I'm not going to be responsible for all the identities and the app pools and all that kind of junk. Someone else is going to do that, right? Namely, in our scenario, Microsoft is going to do that, okay? Or in the scenario we're talking about, Microsoft is going to do that. They're going to be responsible for the disaster recovery piece, right? They're going to be responsible for managing the hardware and managing the performance of the environment. And they're simply going to charge us a nominal fee every month for all the users that are hitting it, okay? Really simplifies a lot of stuff, right? Really simplifies a lot of stuff for us because we don't have to worry about the big upfront cost of buying the hardware, the big upfront cost of buying all the licenses, configuring all of that stuff, managing the performance. What we're responsible for really is just making sure that we buy the licenses through Office 365 for how many people are going to hit it and give those people the accounts, right? We're also responsible for the content, obviously, and we're also going to have the ability to build some custom solutions inside of this hosted environment, provided we work within a certain realm, right? We work within a certain boundaries here, and we'll look at some of that stuff. So these are our two options here that you can go through and use, all right? Now, so the hosted options here, the on-premise deployment is going to give us the most flexibility for the solutions that we want to build, right? Not forget about the fact that I'm saying farm or sandbox or any of that kind of stuff. The things that I want to build as a developer, the things I want to configure, I can do whatever I want to do in my environment, providing they haven't kicked me out of the server room from doing stuff that I don't want to do, that they don't want me to do. We can do whatever we want with an on-prem deployment here, right? I can configure the topology, full reign. In a hosted deployment, though, I don't have those options. There's really kind of two ways that you can kind of boil down the hosted options here. One of them, again, Office 365, and specifically with Office 365, it's got a couple different offerings. One of them is Exchange Online, one of them is Link Online, one of them is SharePoint Online. The SharePoint Online piece is the only thing we're really going to be talking about here, okay? Now, the SharePoint Online piece you'll see has got some limitations to it. Above and beyond the limitations that we have on-prem for these kind of sandbox different things that we can build. But there's also another opportunity that you can look at, and we're not going to explore this week, but there's another opportunity where there are third-party vendors who are also standing up their own hosted implementations of SharePoint. Companies like FP Web and Rackspace that are out there, you can go through and build your applications, and you can actually host your SharePoint environments with them and not have to host them with SharePoint Online or with Microsoft. What I find is that SharePoint Online, or SPO, is the most restricted of the hosted options. So it's going to be your least common denominator. If you can develop to that, you're going to work in all of the other ones. Other ones, like the third-party ones that I mentioned a second ago, they may offer additional capabilities that Office 365 is not providing you. Okay? So we'll talk a little bit more about some of those things this week. And the different vendors have just different things that they're going to sit there and offer. Now, if you look at the on-prem thing here, what kind of options do we have here? Well, you can use SharePoint Foundation, you can use SharePoint Server, you could use the Standard Edition, you can use the Enterprise Edition of SharePoint Server. It's totally up to you. You can use some of the Fizz licenses that you have to make it internet-facing as well. And when you install this, when you install your own piece here, I said earlier that you have full control over whatever you want to choose, whatever things you want to leverage. Well, that means you can leverage any of the service apps that are included by SharePoint, right? No holds barred. Business intelligence, performance point services. I shouldn't start enumerating those, because now I'm blanking on that big list. The list is so long and you just get scared of all the things that are there. What can I choose from? Like manage metadata, or let's stop there. Lesson 1 when presenting, don't go off script. So you also have, like I said, the full development options. In an on-prem scenario, I could build a custom service app if I wanted to, if I was doing some sort of data aggregation. Now, maybe a bad example, because the first question you should ask is, why am I building a custom service app? It's a massive thing to kind of bite off. However, it's not even an option in the hosted scenario. There's no way you're going to be able to do a custom service app. Just not possible, okay? But we have full control over being able to use full access to using all of those service apps, and we have full access to building whatever we want, using whatever technology we want on our SharePoint on-prem deployment, okay? Use anything we want. We want to install, we say, I want to use something with OpenXML. We need to install the OpenXML SDK onto the server. SharePoint Online, I need to use OpenXML. Microsoft says, fantastic. Send that request to brickwall@microsoft.com. We'll get right on that, right? You're not going to get much distance on that one. You're not going to get much success on there. So let's look at the customization options for an on-prem. Well, customization options, again, you can do whatever you want. Server-side, if you're doing server-side code, we can write full trust, nice farm scope solutions. We can do sandbox solutions if we wanted to as well. If we were in an environment where we force people to only use on-prem or only use Sandbox for developing things, you could force that as well if you wanted to. You can do that in your on-prem deployment. It's totally up to you. What if you look at it and they say, well, you have to work inside the Sandbox? And you're like, okay, I have to work in the Sandbox. And you say, well, no, I don't want to work in the Sandbox because I want to do these other things. And they said, oh, well, there's this whole concept called breaking out of the Sandbox, which is kind of funny that Microsoft, when they announced Sandbox, at the same time, they're like, and here's ways of getting out of the Sandbox. I'm like, isn't that a farm solution? So here's this great new thing, and we'll show you how not to use it. Okay, anyway. Anybody from Microsoft? I should probably ask that. Yeah. I always do that. I always forget to ask that before I start. Any admins in the room? Anybody from marketing? Any attorneys? Anybody from Microsoft? Let's see. Any admins in the room? Oh, no. We got one. Okay, raise your hand. All right, there he is. Get him. I'm just kidding. You keep us honest. Except for that guy. Now, some of the options you have for breaking out of the Sandbox, one of them is this thing called a fully trusted proxy. Right? In a fully trusted proxy, what this is that you're going to build a farm solution that can do the stuff that you can't do in the Sandbox. So let's say I'm going to go call some web service. Can't do that because the web permission is not granted to code running inside the Sandbox using code access security. However, in a full trust solution, one where the site is running under the medium level of trust, which we find most sites are running under, then what you'll see is that you can actually write something that's going to go call out some web service or some RESTful service or make a call to some third-party database like AdventureWorks or something like that, right? So what I would do is write a farm trust solution that does that stuff, that does that work, and then I'm going to create this little proxy object that's going to say, I can do this thing right here and accept these parameters. And I'm going to register that using a farm scoped feature And now my Sandbox solutions, I can tell the people building Sandbox solutions that, hey, guess what? There's this cool thing out there that you can go through and leverage. Okay, what's it called? It's this, and you call it with these methods and these parameters. Like, okay. And then so your Sandbox solution can call into this fully trusted proxy that does things on your behalf and then hands them back to the Sandbox solution. Okay, that's one way of breaking out of the Sandbox. Kind of strange, though, because you still have to build a full farm solution, and then you kind of, after you architect this, you kind of take a step back, show it to your manager, and he's like, why don't we just build farm trust in the first place? You know. Yeah, so we could. The other option, you can do custom CAS. Now, this is a debatable thing, or this is a controversial thing, because some people say, no, you shouldn't be showing people this whole thing. I'm going to tell you about it, and then I'm going to let you decide if you want to do this or not. A lot of the things, there's two things that block us from doing stuff inside of the Sandbox. Okay? First one is the fact that Microsoft has created an assembly that is a subset of the entire API of things that we can do. So they've pulled things out like SP Farm and SP Web Application and the constructor for SP Site and SP Security, right? They pulled out a lot of that stuff. And that new object model that our code in the Sandbox is going to run against is simply just, think of it like a proxy. It's just kind of hand off the stuff to the fully trusted one. But if there's no SP Farm in the proxy, I can't actually get to the SP Farm object. I'm going to get an error there when it runs. Okay? That's one way that Microsoft blocks stuff. The other way that they're going to block stuff is using a custom code access security policy file. And that policy is what's saying any code that runs in the Sandbox gets these permissions, or in other words, can do these things. There are two things that are missing from that CAS policy. Web permission, which allows me to make calls to web services, or really makes external web calls, and SQL permission to connect to databases. So is there anything stopping me from registering those two permissions in the CAS policy that Microsoft uses for the Sandbox, and then adding those to the code group and saying, here you go, now you can make web permissions from the Sandbox? Technically, no, there's nothing stopping me from doing that. Am I still supported? Oh, well, one thing you have to understand about when Microsoft says, is that supported in SharePoint? 99.9% of the time is Microsoft saying, it's not supported, which internally translates to, we didn't write a test case for that, so we don't know if that works or not. The other 1% of the time is stay out of the database, right? So we don't know if stuff does or does not work in there, right? But let's think about it. If you're a .NET guy, you're like, well, it's CAS, right? Yeah. Did SharePoint reinvent CAS? No, they're the only ones using it. They're the only ones left using it, okay? So, sorry, that might have been out loud. Yeah, how many of you know what CAS is? Code access. How many of you do not know what code access security is? Come on. Okay. So, got a couple people going. Well, you're SharePoint. How many of you use it in production and you're not with SharePoint? Yeah, that's right. Okay. So let me explain what CAS is really quick. There's a little tangent here because a couple people were brave enough to raise their hands. A couple of them were like going, I don't know what the semicolon is in C#. So basically what it is, right, is that, remember, it's best to give like an example. So remember way back when we had the I love you virus, right? How did that spread so crazily, right, and so quickly? Because we were using something called identity security. And what that is it says that code is going to run under the identity of the person that's logged on to the machine, or as the identity of the person that's running the code. So the I love you virus spread so quickly because we don't do what those guys say. We run as administrator. We click through all the security warnings, right? We don't do the user access control. First thing we all do as developers, install my machine, user access control, boom, slide her all the way down, right? Are you sure you want? Yes. What did that say? I don't know, just yes. Right? We just click straight through it. You're about to attach to? Go for it. Attach. What, are you sure you're doing that? Yeah, the admin's like, oh my God, we got a whole new session we got to do now. Andrew's screwing us up. And the answer is you're already screwed up. Anyway, so, but not you. You're with us, so we're in good shape. Right?
Can you see the sunlight from that hole you're in?
What's that?
Can you see the sunlight from the hole you're in?
Online? This is going online? Strike that. So basically, I do it every time. It's okay. Spence will be over here in a few minutes and start slapping me. But what CAS does is that when I would go through and download that I Love You virus, it would run under my identity. It would get access to my contact list because I have access to it, and it would email itself to everybody else. It did that because it was running under me. Code access security is a much better option, right? Problem is it's just so complicated that nobody uses it because it's so complicated to figure out. But basically what it does is it says, I'm going to define 3 things. 1, here's a list of permissions. 2, here's a group of those permissions, and I'm going to give them a name like foo. 3, here's the code that foo is going to apply to. So out of the box, Microsoft says anything that's signed with this public key token gets full trust. That happens to be ASP.NET, or that happens to be all the SharePoint stuff, right? Then they say, and that's what WS says, and then minimal says that anything running inside the bin directory gets minimal trust, and you can't make web permissions, web calls or something like that. A lot of people shift it over, and they say, no, I'm going to use WSS medium. Medium says, oh, we'll throw in a SQL permission and a web permission all in one. We get buy 2, get 1 free, right? We'll throw those in. Buy 1, get 1 free. So when you do that, right, that's how you're getting these additional permissions inside of your, inside when you go to medium. What CAS is doing is they have their own policy file that says you get these permissions. All you have to do is go to that CAS policy file, add 2 more permissions, add them to the code group that all the stuff gets, and poof, your Sandbox solutions now get web permission and SQL permission, okay? So you could do that. Now, disclaimer here, why would you not want to do that? Well, because people say, hey, now the Sandbox doesn't run the way it's supposed to run. SharePoint hasn't been tested to run like this, blah, blah, blah. It's like, really? You're blocking it with something from .NET. You're not breaking SharePoint. SharePoint's using something. You're just doing something a little bit differently with this, right? With how CAS works and how they're enforcing it. It's an option. I personally don't have a problem with it. Other people do. Neither one of us is wrong. We're both right, right? So it just depends. Or we're both wrong, however you want to look at it. I like to think of it the other way, though. Now, the other option you have when you're doing on-prem deployment here is client-side based stuff, right? So with client-side, you can use whatever technology you want. You can use JavaScript. You can create JavaScript objects. You can do AJAX stuff. You can do jQuery. You can do Silverlight. You can do all that stuff. Silverlight's not dead yet. But you can do any of this stuff that you want, right? It's got this looming Grim Reaper behind it, I think, but it's still around. But we can use anything we want on the client side to get around some of the mitigations that we had. We want to be able to talk to a database. Fine. Wrap that database up in a service, or write a service that's going to expose the database. Wrapping a database in a service is probably a bad idea. But go through and write a service that's going to go through and expose that data, right? And then you can use jQuery, you can use Silverlight to go pull that data back out of that service, even if it's in a different domain using some of the cross-domain techniques that we have. Right? You can do that all client side. There's a way to get around the Sandbox limitations. Another kind of thing that's nice about this is that when your stuff is running in the client, even if you're using the client-side object model or using the RESTful list service that we have in 2010, none of that stuff is going to be subject to the resource counters and stuff that we get in with Sandbox solutions, because SharePoint doesn't know where those requests are coming from. It doesn't know to allocate that stuff back to that solution. So it's a way to get around some of the solution resource monitoring stuff. So those are our on-prem customization options that we have. Now let's look at SharePoint Online here. Now what SharePoint Online is that every customer is going to be running on the same shared hardware. And I say the same, it's not like some massive box. It's that their data center, SharePoint's installed, lots of different places, and it's in the same data centers where all the Azure stuff is as well. So nice, good uptime, reliability, all that kind of stuff. We call each customer in these different deployments, we call them tenants. Find that trips a lot of people up. A lot of the guys over there in the IT pro side, they keep saying tenant or tenancy or multi-tenancy, and everybody's just kind of like, is that like a new word or something? It's easy to think about it. On our side, the developer side, think about an apartment building. It has multiple tenants. It's an apartment building is multi-tenancy, right? Same kind of thing here. SharePoint is the building, and we have multiple customers or tenants running on that one SharePoint installation, okay? So each tenant is going to essentially get like a web app. Think about it like that. They're going to get like a web application here. They're going to be allowed to do a lot of stuff, but some things are not going to be permitted inside of SharePoint Online. Right? Some service applications are simply not going to be there and be available to us. because they don't work well in a hosted scenario. Right? They simply won't work well, or we can't control the permissions very effectively in a hosted scenario. Okay? Now, look at just some of the different hosting plans that are out there. Has anybody gone through and tried to look at this stuff with Office 365 and what different hosting plans are there? And they give you this table, and you're looking at it like, yeah, so what about all the other details? And they're like, well, here's a Word doc to go figure it all out. And you're like, that couldn't have been on the web. But anyway, there's a couple different kinds of plans you can have. There's a P plan, which they call it for small business, but you can think about it more as like going, I just want a plan to share with my family, right? Because it's very limiting. And then there's E plans, and the E plans give us more capabilities specifically around SharePoint. They do a lot more stuff with like Exchange and with Link as well, but specifically around SharePoint, the E plans are going to give us more capabilities here. Now, the E1 plan is very similar to the E2, 3, and 4 plans. The cost with each one goes up. The big difference with these is that with the E1 plan, you only get the ability to look at stuff. With the Office web apps like Excel and Word and PowerPoint, you can't edit them. So you don't get the ability to edit stuff. So generally speaking, when you're looking to go use SharePoint in the cloud and you're specifically looking at SharePoint Online, I don't see many people going with anything below an E2. Right? That's, for the most part, I see everybody going with E2 or E3 or E4. Right? And it just depends on what you're looking for outside of SharePoint for which one of those plans you're going to look at. Okay? So that's basically what it is. There is one thing you want to keep in mind, though, is that if you go with a P plan, there's no switching. Right? You're stuck in P. However, if you're in E, you can jump around between the different E's, and I think you can even jump back down to a P from the E's. You can't do that. I thought you could, but you can't. I got the nod just a second ago. Right? So scratch that. Now, some of the service applications that are available to us inside of SharePoint Online. We can do some stuff. For example, manage metadata. He's there. We can work with managed metadata. Specifically, though, you can only work with taxonomies within the site collections that you're in your environment. There's no like enterprise content type stuff, right? You're really only focused just the managed metadata piece, the taxonomy stuff, right? InfoPath Form Services, you do get that capability. You can work with InfoPath Form Services. You can work with user profiles to an extent, okay? You can work with the Business Data Connectivity, BCS services. Now, there's a thing with BCS where, that I'll talk about in a second. You can also do, that's a characteristic of SPO compared to an on-prem. Same thing with Secure Store. You can work with Secure Store. A couple notable limitations here. So, first of all, you can only support authenticated users with SharePoint Online. There's no anonymous kind of story here. There is a little website that you can have that's like a kind of internet-facing site, but it's not like SharePoint internet-facing. You can't do like a web content management kind of site here. So as you see there on the third point there, no publishing. No web content management's available to us, right? No business intelligence. There's the oxymoron. You can't do any business intelligence kind of stuff. No performance point services or stuff like that inside of SharePoint Online. We don't get to use Word automation services. You might be starting to kind of pick up on some stuff that you saw before lunch, and you're hearing me say, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. So you kind of might get a feel for which way we're going to go with this whole thing. With BCS, as of last November, Microsoft gave us BCS in the cloud. Very cool. However, with BCS, we can go against two different targets. We can go against databases, and we can go against web services. But in the cloud, we can't go straight to databases. In the cloud, the only option that we can go against is our WCF services. All right? Now, there's some tricks associated with this if you want to if you want to expose a WCF service to SharePoint in the cloud and you want to be able to leverage it. Works just fine, but then there's this authentication kind of bit that you're going to run into where it's basically saying, yeah, there's no authentication here, right? So there's a lot of extra work you have to end up doing to get this to work. Just as a footnote, because it's kind of out of scope for what we're doing this week, if that's something you want to look at, there's a blog post by a guy by the name of Steve Fox, who works for Microsoft and has a blog post up and walks through, I think he published it sometime in January, that walk through the pieces of what you would have to do to go through and to make this a little bit more secured option, right? It's a really good post if you're interested. All right. Now, okay, so those limitations, I can get past those. What are my different options for building something custom inside of SharePoint Online, aside from using what we get out of the box? Well, from the server-side code option, you are limited to these Sandbox solutions. You cannot do farm trust solutions because farm trust could affect many other customers, okay? We don't want that. So you can only be limited to user code / partial trust / Sandbox solutions. They're all the same thing, all right? Now, in addition, though, in addition to the standard limitations we're going to find with the Sandbox solutions, Office 365 imposes additional limitations, right? There's additional namespaces that you're going to be blocked from using. And they do that using these validators, this validation framework, okay? The fun part is they don't do a good job of publishing what else is blocked. So hopefully we will help you with that list a little bit this week here. When you want to mitigate some of the problems that you have or challenges you're going to have with the Sandbox, go to a client-side solution. That's one option. Another option, get your business logic out of SharePoint. If you got some big thing you're doing, build a WCF service and host it somewhere else. Build a client-based solution. Your client-based solution can call out to that service. What you notice here is that the two options for mitigating the Sandbox that I showed you earlier with On-Prem are not available here. There's no way in the world they're going to let you touch the CAS policy. If you manage to do that, you might want to let them know. They'll probably give you a little bit of a prize for showing them a massive security hole that they left, right? The other thing that they're not going to let you do is fully trusted proxies. Why? Because they're fully trusted. And they're not going to let you deploy anything full trusts in the cloud. So, client-side limitations, it's the client, it's the browser. They can't stop you from doing anything. Do whatever you want, right? Silverlight, JavaScript, jQuery, Ajax, blah, 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 all this different stuff. Use the cool JS render stuff. Use data.js to pull data web services down or OData services down. Whatever you want to do. You can do whatever you want the client, okay? And you can do some really cool stuff with this. If you're savvy on the HTML5 stuff, then you can get a lot of stuff done. Do some really cool implementations with that, right? And really cool applications with HTML5 stuff, right? Never mind that HTML5 always seems to be 5 years away, but that's different. I think that's why the name is in there. Now, some of the limitations here for custom solutions here. Like on-premise, we can do anything we want client-side, like I said, but for server-side, we're limited to a subset of things available to that are available to us in the Sandbox. So that's the stuff I was just saying a second ago. Got a little bit ahead of myself. They're doing that with solution validators. So this week, we'll show you a little bit of a way, or I'll talk a little bit about how you can get around that if we have a little bit of time to talk more about how to see some of the things that they're, sorry, not how to get around it, but how to understand and check your code without, well, let's see if they block this. Throw it up there. Oh, yep, they blocked that. Let's try something else. So they blocked this? Nope, they blocked that. Okay. So we'll see if we can go through and show you some of that stuff. Okay, so after we looked at all of that stuff, we then kind of said, all right, we got our requirements, we got our use cases, we got our stuff that we want to do, we know we want to build, where are we going to go? We understand the hosted options, we understand the on-prem options, which side are we going to go with? You say, you know what, we're going to do this as an on-prem solution. Is there some stuff here that we want and we have in our use cases? We just got to make sure that we can nail. And with a hosted solution, we don't think we can do it, right? So we think it's going to be easier to implement things this way in an on-prem instead of going with 365. You really have to make this decision early on which direction you're going to go. Now, the thing that we built that you're going to see this week that throughout today and tomorrow and Wednesday is going to be a solution that's deployed for a on-prem deployment. Okay? Now, that is not to say it is impossible to build what we have built for 365. That's not what we're saying. Because you could do it, but it's going to require a lot of different decisions and a lot of different assumptions, and you really don't want to build something that says, hey, it'll work in 365 and in SharePoint Online, especially when you're doing something like this. If you're a vendor, that's different. Because you're a vendor, you might want to build something that's going to work in both of them, right? And maybe say, well, this piece works or this piece doesn't work. But for ours, we want to focus and just say, look, let's keep it simple. We're going to focus for on-prem. All right? A 365 deployment is going to be a little bit different. So there are things that impacted some of our design. Now, we did want to make it, if we did build this whole thing, we did want to keep in mind that, we may want to move this to 365 one day. So we said, let's only do stuff that, let's try and not do things that would be a complete dead end if we went in that direction with 365. So for example, the guys earlier were talking about publishing. And they said, how are we going to go through and do these articles? We could do them as publishing pages. Hey, we get to check in, check out. We get the publishing infrastructure and blah, blah, blah. Oh, it's fantastic. It's what we need. You're like, oh, that's not in 365. We're going, yeah, we'd have to scrap that entire thing and move to lists or document libraries if we wanted this to go in the cloud, right? So that's one decision that we kind of looked at and said, let's not go with publishing, right, that you'll see here. So some things were pretty hard calls here. Another case, we want to be able to generate PDFs. SharePoint says, I can do that, and I can do it very nice. It's called Word Automation Services. We can do that and generate PDFs just fine, or generate documents just fine. But it's not in the cloud. And we're like, yeah, that piece of candy was too hard to pass up. We're going to use it in Word Automation. Something like that, right? So there may be other options we can look at with this. So one of the things we'll look at is later in the week, we'll look at what would be involved in actually going through and doing this and moving to like a 365. But for now, we're going to focus on an on-prem deployment here, okay? So with that, does anybody have any questions before we kind of move on? Eric has a question. He's coming right on up. What's your question?
Are you done?
I'm done now. Yeah, now I'm done.
Mike, turn his off.
Oh.
Okay, so as you can tell, a lot of this particular portion here is the why. This piece here is so you don't ask us 100 questions later about why did you build the solution that way. This tells you the direction that we're going for how the solution was built. It's also the kind of questions that you have to answer when you're designing solutions yourself. So let me bring this slide back up where we talked earlier about how the different artifacts that we're going to use to build our solution. Now, this is fine, but these are a little loosey-goosey over here. They're just business requirements. They don't specify any specific SharePoint artifacts that we have to utilize. So let's go from there, from our high level, and let's step down. Why are we going to, here's sort of the why of the different pieces that we're using. I talked to you earlier about the web part because we're moving away from the publishing infrastructure, so we're going to go the web part route. One of the hard calls we made was on list forms. Between you and me, and everybody listening and who will watch this on DVD and who tweets this right now, Eric hates list forms. Okay, just mark that down, all right? That's an absolute. They're awful. Adding your own UI to them, adding fields to them, it's exceptionally painful. And I don't like to use them. My initial goal was to do all this in a nice little form. However, that's redundant. It does give you all the stuff out of the box to make all your edits, and it gives you the ribbon and all that other jazz. So this is an argument I lost in this discussion, and we decided to go with list forms. Okay? If you don't like it, blame them down there. One of the things we wanted to leverage was search. Big time, because we felt there was a lot of cool stuff we could do with search, even though we knew making that decision meant we wouldn't be able to take that portion online. So some of the cool bits around the whole search piece, they're not going to be able to go out of our on-prem environment. BCS, this one cuts both ways. So this particular part, even though it's going to be in the advanced section, which they're going to do tomorrow morning, can be used both online and on-prem. So that one goes both ways. That's good for us. People search, enterprise as well, and user profiles, and then finally the word automation stuff. So these were the things that we were thinking about in why would we use these various pieces and how are we going to put all this stuff together. Okay, we've got two solutions. We have a core solution, which is the basic stuff that we're going to be building that we know we can move through the majority of the process from on-prem to online. Then we have an advanced solution that's going to be the stuff that we know isn't, with the exception of the BDC, absolutely is not going to go online. This is going to stay on-prem. This is how we broke it out, and here are our artifacts. In our core solution, we're going to be deploying our site columns, our content types, our list instances, web part pages, some basic styling, custom actions, and web parts. This is the stuff that we're going to be developing over here. This is how our solution is going to look. In fact, when you see our solution design, if you were thinking earlier about the solution design that Victor put together, you're going to see it maps almost directly to what we've got working on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, the advanced stuff that they'll cover tomorrow, bringing all these pieces in together. What we did was draw a fine line between them and say, if you want to go Sandbox or online, you're going to go with the core solution on the left. If you want to go, if you're going to in a fully on-prem environment, you're able to use the solution on the right. So no matter what environment that you're in, you can take this code and you can utilize it. If you're in an on-prem environment, take the whole thing, slap it together, you've got a full solution. If you're only in an online or a Sandbox environment, you at least have the core base functionality of the solution that you can take and leverage. Deployment model. This was a big discussion, and I think you already know the direction that we're going to go in for this, but let's step through it for a moment. Our various pieces and parts, where do they work? Content types, Sandbox, Farm Solution, either way. List instances, also good. We can do either one of those. Event receivers, or I'm sorry, pages, we can do those, but remember we're just talking about web part pages. We're not talking about publishing pages. Here's one, event receivers. Put a big fat asterisk next to event receivers in the Sandbox. Does anyone know what the limitation is on event receivers in the Sandbox? Can you do them? Okay, what can't you do? Event receivers defined in code. Event receivers must be done declaratively in the Sandbox. Okay, so who cares? If you do them declaratively, that's a hard word for me. If you do them declaratively, see, I can't get it. If you do them in XML, switch off. So I got to switch. And you have not done a custom list instance, and you activate them, there's that little line in there that says the list type that you have to apply them to, and if you choose one of the base list types, like, oh, I don't know, 101, it's going to activate that event receiver for all lists of that type in that site. Boo, that stinks. All your document libraries get your event receiver, okay? In order to do this in the Sandbox, you must also do the list instances because you have to have a specific ID to apply it to. So we all do, because we're real creative, we all do 10,001 as our custom list ID, right? So when you ship the solution to someone else, it'll break their farm, but that's their problem.
When I have an alternative, then I'll show you in our next session. Don't go away.
Ooh. All right. Custom actions. Custom actions, this is good. It works on both sides. No worries there. We can do custom actions, menu items, right? But not edit control block. We're talking about side actions, menu, pardon?
No custom action groups.
And no custom action groups. That's right. But you can do just add to the site actions menu and whatnot. Web parts, easy peasy. Either one will work. BCS works in both. I put another asterisk right here because in this case, BCS is only going to work with WCF Services. And if you're online and want to call back, you've got to do the whole service bus dance in order to make that happen. Enterprise search, farm only. Same for managed metadata and word automation. But put an asterisk on managed metadata right here because you can, in fact, do managed metadata in the Sandbox or online at the site collection level. But it's restricted only to that particular site collection, and you don't get the enterprise content type stuff. And because we are leveraging content types here, then we couldn't use the Sandbox managed metadata stuff. We had to go into the farm. And finally, the big kahuna, of course, is Online Office 365. Sandbox will work in this scenario. Farm obviously won't. So just to map it over to what we did before, here's your core components, here's your advanced components, and that's how we're going to build this thing out. So you'll see how those artifacts map over. We're going to, so your job here, okay, on the O365 is to act surprised on Wednesday when the IT pros come over and say, hey, we got to take this to the cloud. Okay, pretend like we didn't talk about it. You're supposed to go, no! Okay. All right. So, it kind of is, isn't it? I didn't say exactly that. Anyway. Let's talk about the Sandbox, all right? This is a difficult decision to make. How many of you have written Sandbox solutions? Raise your hands. How many of you found it an enjoyable and loving experience? Give me some of what you're smoking, Bubba. Why? Wait a minute. You wrote them, and then I said, did you like it? And you put your hands down. What's the problem? Missing at least half of the API. That's being generous, yes. What else? Pardon?
For a long time, it didn't tell you if you did something wrong.
If you did so you're talking about great error handling? Yeah, okay. And also nothing in the, when you're building the code to say, oh, you can't do this because you chose Sandbox, right? This is a big discussion. And the reason that it happens is because IT pros think the Sandbox is manna from heaven because they can stop your code from running, okay? Never mind that the way they stop it is a beautiful error message that gets printed that says, this has been disabled and the users can't see any content. They don't care about that. It didn't bring down their farm. That's what they're happy about. So they go to the decision maker, whoever that is, and says, we must, governance, we must do everything in the Sandbox. And by the time you get looped into the discussion, that decision has already been made, right? Now you must code for the Sandbox. This is a perfect opportunity for you as a developer to sit in a meeting with the business people and go, nope, can't have that, not doing it, won't work, right? I got some vacation time, I'm going to take it because this project is going nowhere, right? What's going to happen is the needs of the business are going to intersect, right, with the limitations of the Sandbox, and it's all going to fall apart. Will you end up having to use the Sandbox at some point in your life? Yes, you will. If you're going to code for SharePoint, you must learn how to deal with the Sandbox. So we're going to talk about it a little bit. What I want to give you here is the ammunition for you to have this discussion inside your environment, because if you haven't had it yet, you will have it. Especially if you're working with clients or your company's considering going online, you really got to think about the Sandbox problem. So let's talk about the Sandbox. I'm going to deep dive a little bit on some developer-specific stuff for the Sandbox. Then we're going to flip it over and look how the code is all written. Okay, really quickly. Sandbox, everything runs in a restricted set of permissions, as AC was talking about. It's monitored and controlled by the IT staff. Boo. So that they can turn your stuff on or off as need be and set rules and points and all that stuff around it. Here's the tricky bit we need to know, okay? This is how it all works. Got it? Okay. There's this thing called the SP user code host service that runs, and it creates application domains for all the stuff that's going to be running inside of your code, and it all works in this nifty, neat little graphic here, and at the end of the day, it doesn't let you do squat. At least that's the objective. Let you do, I shouldn't say that. Let you do, strike that from the record. Take that off. It lets you do limited things, okay? And you've got this whole proxy piece you have to deal with and all that jazz that happens around there. Basically, what's going on is that they're taking everything that you built, putting it inside this separated process that's running, that's in a restricted set of permissions, and you can't really break out of that. You can do the WSS medium thing if you want, which helps somewhat. That won't do you any good online. So for the most part, you're stuck with sort of dealing with that. What things can't you do in the Sandbox? Well, you can't do any kind of web communication, period. You can't do RSS feeds. You can't do an HTTP web request. You can't get any of that stuff. You can't call the Microsoft SharePoint administration namespace or the security namespace or a bunch of others. You can't do coded workflows. You can't do timer jobs. You can't elevate privileges. You can't do SP grid view. You can't do logging to the ULS. You can't do external lists. Have I convinced you not to use the Sandbox yet? Okay, I can keep going. There's lots of things you can't do. This is your slide to take to your boss that says, nope, we're not doing Sandbox. We're going farm, baby, so all of our code runs. Here's your object limit. This is just a reference slide so you look and see what the objects are that you can get to. There's things you can't do. Simple stuff you wouldn't think of, like SP site, not there in the Sandbox. Can't use it. Monitoring. Okay, let's talk about this for a minute. This is how the IT pros get to turn your stuff off. The SP user code process is logging specific things that happen. I'm going to show you a slide in a minute that tells you exactly what those things are. All of these count toward a total of points. Once your total of points has been reached, it shuts down everything in the user code process on that site collection. So everything stops running, bang, you're done. The processes get terminated until that time window for the point collection has expired. So there's a lot of things that go into figuring out this point total and this whole algorithm and how it works. Here are the resources that are being tracked to calculate a point for terms of monitoring those processes that are running. CPU execution time, memory consumption, abnormal termination. This is a biggie. If things abend, those really spike up the point count. Unhandled exceptions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All this boils down into one big big algorithm like 2 people in Redmond and 1 person in Sri Lanka somewhere understands, right? It's about that long. But this is what's going on, all right? So this is your little cheat sheet, so the IT pros can't give you a bunch of hooey about what's going on like it's some magical thing. If you have something abend, you get 1 point, okay? Simple as that. CPU execution time, 200 of those cycles will equal 1 point. And so you can sort of read down the list and see what those, what each of those does. I like process I/O bytes and process virtual bytes. They're almost meaningless because it takes a whole lot of them to generate a point. But things like unresponsive processes and unhandled exception counts will get you. This one will really get you. Right? If you don't know if something is bailing out in your code and causing a failure, you didn't put in a try-catch block or whatever, but your code is still running, this one will stack up on you really fast and get you a bunch of points and knock you out, knock your code out of the sandbox. Okay? The most important things to look for when you're doing sandbox code is, am I doing anything that requires really long-running operations? Right? If I am, and I'm not using the SP long-running operation constructor, then I need to refactor that code so I can use it. These things will eat up your points in a big fat hurry. Make sure everything is in a try-catch block and that you're handling those exceptions and handling them gracefully. Make sure you got your finalies in there so things fall out through. That way you don't hit the big ones that are going to knock your code out. Okay? Solution validators. This is the COP when you upload your solutions into the solution gallery that says whether or not these solutions can be activated and will run. The one in SharePoint Online is exceptionally restrictive. Unfortunately, there's no real way to know if it's going to pass those solution validators until you try and upload it. A good portion of the stuff works, but there's some things that they restrict you from doing there. Internally, you can write your own solution validators, if you wish, in your environments. If you're forced into using the sandbox, you can. This is all flexible, so you can write your own solution validators to inspect and reject assemblies as you need to do inside of your environment. Okay, here's the proxy. How it works is actually really simple. If you do need to do a full trust proxy, all of this, by the way, is documented in the PNP guidance. So if you, how many people have gotten the SPG PNP guidance for 2010? Okay, a few of you, not very many. Microsoft.com/SPG, SharePoint guidance. We spent a ton of time working on this, building out use cases around BCS and mysterious things like SP Metal and Link and doing stuff for sandbox proxies. And all that code is there for you to steal, borrow and use in your solutions. And it's all documented. So we have background documentation on all this stuff. So if you want to know how to write a full trust proxy in a sandbox environment, we show you exactly how to do it step by step with the code. It's actually pretty simple. It's an operation and some arguments, and there's nothing really mysterious to it, and they're not going to let you do it anyway, so just click farm and next. All right. So I'm going to, let's wrap this up because we want to get to the actual code piece. So here's what I want you to understand about what we're going to be doing next. We're going to build the sandbox part of this solution, and you're going to see that we made some decisions in the stuff we did specifically to work inside of the sandbox environment. So when you look at the solution instruction and go, I wouldn't do that, bear in mind that this is the decision we made to carry this all the way through an online deployment. The stuff that is not fitting inside the sandbox, search, BCS, word automation, all that stuff, that is tomorrow. They're going to go deep dive on all that code all the way through tomorrow. Then we're going to come back at the end of the day tomorrow and performance test a bunch of this stuff, okay? So just setting that up for what to expect in the next one. Paul's going to walk you through all of the bits of the code for our sandbox portion of the solution. So let's go ahead and take a break. Now, about 5 or 6 minutes early, we'll take some questions if you like on this portion, then we'll come back in and we'll get to all the heavy demo. Cool?